Welcome to the Greener Way podcast, a show about people, planet, and purpose, and how investors and corporate leaders push forward in a complex world. In this episode of The Greener Way, we're speaking with Jack Latimore. Jack is the Indigenous Affairs journalist at The Age here in Melbourne. He's a Birpai man with family ties to the Thungutti and Gumbaynggirr nations. Later this year, Australian citizens will be asked to vote in a referendum to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the Constitution by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. The voice will be an advisory body to, quote, make representations to the Parliament and the executive government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, unquote. The vote on voice is being widely debated, and many institutions, including key Australian businesses and investors, have either publicly come out in favour of the vote or are mulling whether to publicly take a stance. I've asked Jack to this episode to discuss how he approaches covering this historic time for The Age, how he vets sources within Indigenous communities, and how people can better educate themselves as they consider how to vote later this year. Jack, that was a really long introduction. Thank you so much for being here. Can you introduce yourself, your role as the Indigenous Affairs reporter at The Age?
It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Jack Latimore. I am the Aboriginal Affairs journalist at 9 newspapers, starting with The Age, and sometimes my work goes beyond into the other newspapers. I'm the first Aboriginal journalist doing Aboriginal Affairs reporting there ever, as far as I know.
It's great to know. I've been following your coverage of the Voice referendum as well as your wider coverage for years, going to your previous employers, Jack. Can you please help us place the vote on voice to Parliament in its historical context, and also in terms of addressing the current barriers for Aboriginal people in Australia?
Well, in terms of the voice in its historical context, possibly goes back to, it does go back to 2011. But we first heard of constitutional recognition in terms of a voice in around 2015, 2016. And that was a referendum council that was appointed to go around and take the temperature on what Aboriginal people were thinking when they thought about things like constitutional recognition. They had a number of dialogues, regional dialogues around Australia. And from those, what the referendum council heard was that people wanted another body that would advise on policies and programs that affect the lives of Aboriginal people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So, yeah, it's got a fairly long sort of provenance there. In 2011, if we want to go back there, you had Julia Gillard around that period appoint an expert panel. Its final report came back in around 2011, 2012. And within that report, there was some advocacy, I suppose, is a good way to describe it, for greater representation in the way that the government considers and consults with Aboriginal people. Mm-hmm. So from that point to this point, there's been a hell of a lot that have gone on, and there's been a lot of public-facing reports.
Like many people, I'm really working hard to find a wide range of analysis and community leaders to inform myself, both in terms of people who are supporting the referendum and those who have valid criticisms of the process itself. How do you weigh and analyze the different perspectives to the Voice referendum? And how do you bring, your heritage and your experience to bear as you're doing the work of speaking to the communities on this topic?
Yeah, it's a very delicate line to balance along as an Aboriginal person doing Aboriginal affairs, mm-hmm. and specifically around the Voice, and specifically this year. And increasingly so as we get closer towards what we believe will be the referendum date in October. Mm-hmm. In terms of sourcing and considering information from community, there's a number, I guess it's best to think about it conceptually as a tiered approach. You would probably know some of the names that are strong advocates or prominent advocates, mm-hmm. of the Voice and constitutional recognition. And those names, of course, are the ones that generally are attached to the reports. Mm-hmm. So Marcia Langton, Megan Davis, Auntie Pat Anderson, Noel Pearson, of course, There's a whole host there. Tom Karma is another one. Tom Mayo has got some books out. He's a younger one that's come through and sort of risen to prominence around this voice stuff. And then over on the other side, in terms of opposition to the voice, you have people like Warren Mundine, Jacinta Price, Lydia Thorpe. There's a number of people. Well, I guess then we're kind of going into the next tier. There's a lot of people within what has been described as the sovereignty movement, but it is really a lot of different kind of groups or crews that have an issue with constitutional recognition, and that has formed into opposing the voice proposition. And then beyond that, if you go just into general community, and this is where I'm mostly interested in, is how to talk to people that aren't really politically orientated or inclined, how to talk to those people about the voice to get an understanding of their understanding of it, but also what way they're leaning, why, what they feel they lack in terms of information. And yeah, I guess another sort of area is talking to young people as well. Down here in Victoria, we have a model for the voice, I suppose. It's called the First Peoples Assembly in Victoria. And there is an election process that goes towards comprising that, with a number of members made up of those elected, but also those with reserve seats. And in that electoral process, we have, I guess, reduced the age of people allowed to vote down to 16 because we're a young population. So we feel that there should be greater participation at an earlier age, and there has been. So, yeah, you need to find out what young people think about this, because ultimately, although a lot of the voices are coming from people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and sometimes 80s, this proposition is really about leaving a legacy behind that's going to improve the lives of younger people, young Aboriginal people.
I suppose so. Then again, I'd love to dwell in on that a little bit, Jack, and without getting too much sharp and sort of journalist to journalist speak for our listeners. It is something that I turn to your coverage for, and coverage like in places like in other media outlets. How do you go in and get that authentic voice, and that balance between interrogating where people's views lie and playing that role in plugging people into information sources when you're in community doing this work?
Well, it's a different approach to the way that journalism is usually done, the usual routine approach of journalism. That approach results in a lot of what communities see as rip and run type of practices, where journalists, predominantly non-Indigenous, will go in, talk to people, pretty much get what they're after. Like they know, journalists know what they're after before they go in, and they're looking for that confirmation and some lines to quote. So what happens is they go in, they're talking with people from community. They're not known to, in most cases, they're not known to that community in any way. They haven't introduced themselves properly according to cultural protocol and practice. So what they end up leaving with is generally that confirmation, which is not representative of the actual views from within that community, or from even individuals from within that community. And you'll find that quite often with non-Indigenous journalists and people that aren't aware of some of these protocols going into community. Community does that because they want to avoid conflict. So if they ask a question, sources, doesn't matter, what age or whatever, they're generally picking up on the response that is desired from the person asking, and they'll provide that response. And this results, and has always done, when the approach has been this kind of rip and run mentality, doesn't matter whether it's journalism or government policy, it will result in, an inaccurate response, I suppose. And then, of course, the problem lies is when people go back to whoever it is, the policy designers or the newspaper editors, and say, this is what I heard. I heard it from the source. I heard it from the grassroots. But what they've heard is exactly what I described a moment ago, this kind of appeasing response just to avoid conflict because they don't know this person. Trust isn't established. So what I try to do is establish relationships before I go into community, and there's a number of ways to do that. The most simple one that I advise colleagues that I work alongside and have trained people in the past is to contact people that are working within the community, whether it be in the health service, on an elders council. Basically, you're looking for somebody to establish just that introductory sort of relationship, and then you need to put in some time and develop that relationship. And when that person or those persons get to know you and trust you, they'll start introducing you to the people that are appropriate to speak with and that have an informed opinion that is representative of community. Unfortunately, you don't see that approach. It's not common. It's not widespread practice within journalism, particularly, and policy making as well. And that is why people have proposed this voice idea, because it stems from community. It's informed according to the model put forward by Langton and Karma, and which was embraced by the Liberal Coalition Party that lost the election in May last year. And it's the model that's Labor has stated that it's the preferred model for Labor. So, and that's informed from the community itself upwards to this national body proposal, which is representative of those communities and which advises government and executive in Canberra.
I'm really struck by this rip and run phrase that you've brought up, Jack, because, it brings up to me, one of my the foundational books that I go back to so often, Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, this idea that you have to be invited into a community if you're not of the community, and sort of the importance of having that permission to develop relationships that can then lead to movements for change. So I'm really struck by that. And I think it's one of the things that worries me or concerns me as I'm educating myself, as I'm sure listeners to this podcast are as well, that, we're coming in, we're asking questions, but we don't necessarily have those deep relationships ourselves with Aboriginal communities. And so it feels inauthentic, or we feel like we're missing something here.
Yeah. And I mean, as I said, it's absolutely common within the news industry or within journalism. But that is just indicative of the actual issue when it comes to governance. And so there's a useful parallel going on between the two scenarios.
It really is, isn't it? We're trying to figure out how we feel or how we educate ourselves on how to vote for voice. And it's the bigger context is behind it as to how it is we're not talking to each other in a more informed way to begin with.
Yeah, and it comes down to, just to use that sort of metaphor or scenario within journalism, it comes down to a different approach. It's something that I've called slow journalism for a while. There was so much emphasis on being fast and being effective and, everyone's time poor, and to get the essence of a story, to get the meat and the mechanics of it, and then print and move on to the next. But it's not that. It is developing relationships, establishing trust, having cultural ties almost to the community, and that takes time. But the flip side of it is that you're getting rewarded with richer stories and greater information in terms of whether it be the voice or anything else. If it just, for example, if it might be in the terms of mining or whatever, you're going to hear the issues that community have with whatever scenario it is that they're in, and get beyond that sort of front of house is one way of describing it, but that front of house response. And it all comes down to time. And again, this voice proposition is essentially that, asking for the Australian people to develop a meaningful relationship and cultural ties with Aboriginal people. That's why the Uluru Statement, from where the voice stems from, was an invitation.
I like that. And so as we prepare ourselves to take this invitation, potentially, Jack, one of the things that's come up, as I said in the beginning, is that, a lot of people I talk to are trying to find these voices and educate themselves in a way that's meaningful and sensitive. Do you have suggestions as to, credible sources that people should be looking at as they're making up their minds?
Yeah, absolutely. And it doesn't matter which way you fall. Got a great story coming out this week, actually. A couple of young guys up in Northern Territory didn't know which way that they were going to vote. They weren't politically inclined. One was, I think, an electrician who's studying for a teacher's degree, and the other describes himself as a storyteller. So they took the initiative and actually drove around the top end to these communities, their own as well as others. They knew how to go into community, obviously, and they basically wanted to hear from communities and individuals to teach them how to think about it, to educate them on the voice. So I'd be listening to people like that. It doesn't matter if, they're not these prominent authors or lawyers or whatever. Like, it's good to listen to those too. And we know the people there. We know Megan Davis, who you'll be able to catch on ABC. It was one of the early, developers, I suppose, of this voice idea, or Uluru Statement. Very eloquent. Noel Pearson's another who's been around since, talking about this since probably 2011, probably earlier than that. Marshall Langton. And then, if you're falling the other way, there are people there to talk to as well. I wouldn't advise listening to any of the misinformation and disinformation that is being preferred. But if you go into community, you will be able to speak with people who, don't have a political agenda. They've got genuine concerns about the voice, and in terms of prioritising issues within those communities above the voice, they, legitimately believe that, these things are more important. So, yeah, I'd be going in and talking with those people. There's a lot of crazy talk out there. There's a lot of conspiracy theories. It's always good to educate yourself around where those conspiracy theories come from. A lot of that is imported from North America, with Free Men of the Land movement. But, yeah, I mean, in terms of actual texts, I would recommend, the latest quarterly essay from Megan Davis is a good primer. Just go straight in. It's very, you probably get through it in 2 or 3 hours, so it's convenient to read as well. Henry Reynolds' Truth Telling, History, Sovereignty, and the Uluru Statement, I found very useful for something I wrote recently on sovereignty. And just in terms of the approach towards writing about communities, Aboriginal communities, and establishing trust in the work that you do, it could be journalism or it could be policy design or whatever. There's a book that comes out of Canada, and obviously with the Aboriginal people over there, they're a lot further down the pathway than what Australia is. Australia's like it's trodden on a rusty nail or something. But that book is called Everything You Need to Know About the Uluru. No, that's not it. That's the one I was reading off before. That one is called Elements of Indigenous Style, a guide for writing by and about Indigenous people.
Oh, I love a style guide, Jack. I'll definitely get that one.
It is absolutely a style guide, but it's a whole lot more than that. So I get them on ebook, and I refer to them, and I refer other people to them quite often. At NITV, where I was, we also had a user guide, protocol and practices. That's floating around on the internet, so that's available as well. But in terms of people to listen to speaking about the voice, there are so many books out there at the moment. I would emphasise or encourage to get one that's written by an actual Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person. There are a lot of people, as you might suspect, that have seen an opportunity for personal promotion, let's say, off the back of the voice issues, just like any other piece of issue that's kind of taken centre stage on the political on the political front.
Which brings me to a point I wanted to finish on as well, Jack. Cultural sensitivity. You referred earlier in our conversation talking about, we're in the pointy end of the conversation now, and this is shaking out issues through this year that are likely only going to intensify as we get closer to October and the putative date of referendum. How should people be engaging with people in their community of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander heritage in a way that is culturally sensitive and not forcing people to carry additional burden to educate people like me?
Yeah. Well, I would not be asking or not expecting people to pop up and be advocates for the voice. There's a number of reasons for that. Any given person may may be one of the greatest supporters of it, but not want to speak publicly about it because it is such a fraught subject within community. Like it's not divisive, but it's causing conflict and tension that people deal with and get past and exist alongside of. But it's not something that everybody wants to leap forth and talk about. They'll be dealing with all of these tensions and things, these tests on the various community relationships in their own way. And that is a bit like, NAIDOC week. You get inundated with, offers to speak, let's just say burdened with opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
But not everyone, kind of advocates what is at the core of NAIDOC week, and that's a celebration of achievement, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander achievement, and a show of that we've been around and resilience. But not everybody wants to put on a party hat and blow the whistle. So the same with this, just not to put too much weight on anybody having to come out. There's enough dealing with it. There's enough dealing with the public rhetoric out there, the toxic environment that's been created around this topic. An interesting thing, most people remember the atmosphere that was around the same-sex marriage plebiscite, and it did, it was horrible for some people.
Mm-hmm.
Because Aboriginal people only make up 3%, maybe just over 3% of the Australian population. That has been overlooked too often, that really toxic, harmful, violent environment that is current right now
Mm-hmm.
and perpetuated by a lot of the public debate, particularly a lot of the public debate emanating from Canberra. But yeah, it's overlooked because it only affects 3% of Aboriginal, 3% of the population. But it is, I would say, worse than what it was back there. And it's because race has entered into the conversation. You have disinformation that has been peddled by political apparatchiks that, using that Orwellian language,
Mm-hmm.
for example. Some people are more equal than others. So there's a lot of that out in community, and it's it jumps across out of the voice public conversation into other areas that have to do with Aboriginal affairs. So you'll have, for example, someone talking about native title rights, and this is just not a political person, not a voice advocate, completely away from that, but this person who's asserting native title interests, and public commentary is targeting them with really racist stuff that's based on the voice and the No campaign for the voice. So, it's pretty it's insidious out there. So it's difficult to navigate, and Aboriginal people have got enough on their plate dealing with that in their lives. They may not want to jump up and be the advocate in the room every single time they're asked when it comes to the voice.
And with that, I think we'll thank you very much, Jack Latimore, an Aboriginal Affairs journalist at The Age. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and for sharing the process of slow journalism with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Pleasure. Thanks for listening to the Greener Way podcast. If you liked today's show, remember to rate and review us on your podcast platform and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss an episode. Any feedback? Contact us on podcast@fssustainability.com.au. I'm Rachel Allen Backus.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability, a show about people, the planet, and investing in our collective future. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. The Greener Way podcast gives listeners access to information and educational content provided by discussing numerous financial sustainable options and our featured guests. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. The hosts of The Greener Way are not financial professionals and are not aware of your personal financial circumstances. FS Sustainability operates under an Australian Financial Service License and the exemption made available under the Corporations Act 2001 in respect to any information or advice given. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement and, if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.